My name is Marina, and I am the daughter of thieves who mistook silence for surrender. I remember the sound of my father's laughter, a jagged, triumphant noise that echoed through our ancestral halls the moment the taxi pulled away, carrying my grandmother into exile with nothing but a single, bruised suitcase. I watched them use her failing eyesight as a weapon, guiding her trembling hand to sign a document they called protection, but was actually a death warrant for her dignity. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect heist against their own blood. But they forgot that the earth remembers what the heart endures. I saw my parents, once so arrogant in their stolen silk, fall to their very knees on the marble floors they hadn't yet paid for. I saw them beg for a family mercy they had long ago set on fire. And I saw my grandmother stand before them, not as the victim they discarded, but as the architect of their ruin. With the cold elegance of a queen reclaiming her throne, she looked at the wreckage of their souls and said, "You mistook my kindness for fragility. That was your final mistake." This is a story of ink, blood, and the mathematical precision of justice. Thank you, from the depths of my heart, for spending these moments with me today. It is a humble privilege to share these fragments of life and lessons of the spirit with you. If Marina and Grandma's journey touched a chord within your soul, or if you believe that truth is the only foundation worth building upon, we would be deeply honored to have you stay with us. Please consider subscribing to Mother Story, not just as a viewer, but as a companion in our search for light amidst the shadows. Your presence here is a gift we do not take lightly. May your home always be a sanctuary of grace. The house did not merely stand upon the earth. It breathed with the labored, rhythmic pulse of a century's worth of secrets. It was a sprawling Victorian edifice of dark, weeping willow shadows and mahogany bones, a structure that seemed to hold its breath whenever my parents walked through its hallowed halls. To the world, it was an architectural relic, a prized piece of real estate nestled within a prestigious zip code. To my parents, it was a dormant gold mine, a stagnant asset waiting to be liquidated into the cold, hard currency of their social climbing. But to Grandma, and to the ghost of the girl I used to be, it was a sanctuary, a cathedral of dust and sunlight where every creak of the floorboards told a story of a life lived with quiet, unwavering dignity. I remember the smell of that morning most vividly. It was a cloying mixture of expensive French perfume, the sterile scent of freshly printed legal bond paper, and the faint, underlying aroma of cedarwood that always clung to Grandma's skin. The air in the drawing room was heavy, thick with a tension so palpable it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. My mother sat perched on the edge of a velvet settee, her posture a masterpiece of manufactured grace. She looked like a predator draped in silk, her eyes, sharp, calculating, and devoid of warmth, flickering toward the heavy manila envelope that sat on the low tea table like a coiled viper. My father stood by the window, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the pale morning light. He was a man built of sharp angles and even sharper ambitions, his fingers drumming a restless, impatient staccato against the polished wood of the windowsill. He didn't look at the gardens outside, the gardens Grandma had tended for 40 years until her knuckles grew too swollen to grip the spade. He was looking at the perimeter, measuring the distance for a modern expansion, mentally stripping away the ivy and the history to make room for something sleek, glass-walled, and utterly soulless. There is a particular kind of cruelty that wears a smile. I watched them exchange a glance, a silent, telepathic communication of greed that made my stomach churn. They had spent weeks weaving a web of manufactured concern, whispering about safety, medical oversight, and the burdens of maintenance. They spoke of the house as if it were a cage, and of Grandma as if she were a bird too broken to fly, all while eyeing the gold leaf on the ceiling with the hunger of scavengers. In the center of this brewing storm sat Grandma. She looked so small in her high-backed wing chair, a fragile porcelain doll forgotten in a corner of an attic. Her hair was a halo of spun silver, and her hands, etched with the roadmap of 80 years, rested quietly in her lap. She seemed to be drifting in the ebb and flow of her own thoughts, her gaze fixed on a dust mote dancing in a shaft of light. To my parents, This was the evidence they needed, the proof of her fading, the justification for their theft. They saw a woman who was no longer there, a mind retreating into the fog of senility, making her the perfect mark for their elegant heist. But as I stood in the doorway, a silent, complicit shadow, I caught a glimpse of something they missed. For a fleeting second, Grandma's eyes didn't look cloudy. They looked like deep, still wells of ancient water, reflecting everything, absorbing everything, but revealing nothing. The documents were splayed out now. I watched my mother's manicured hand reach out to stroke Grandma's arm, a gesture so performatively tender it made my skin crawl. She began to speak in that high, melodic tone she reserved for charity galas and victims, a voice like honey poured over shards of glass. She spoke of protection and legacy, using words that felt like silk but functioned like a noose. My father joined in, his voice a low, resonant rumble of false stability, promising that this was for her own good, that the house would always be hers in spirit, even if the administrative burden was shifted to younger, more capable hands. They were laying the groundwork for a betrayal so profound it felt like a sacrilege. This house was the only thing Grandma had left of her husband, my grandfather, who had built these walls with the sweat of his brow and the dreams of a young immigrant. Every corner held a phantom of him. The way the light hit the library at noon, the specific scent of his pipe tobacco in the den. By taking this house, they weren't just taking property. They were erasing her history, stripping her of her identity, and casting her into the cold anonymity of a world that has no patience for the old. I felt the bile rise in my throat. I wanted to scream, to knock the tea service off the table, to tear those predatory papers into 1,000 white feathers and scatter them to the wind. But I remained frozen. I was the good daughter, the quiet observer, the one who stayed out of adult business. My silence was a heavy, suffocating shroud. I watched my father unsnap his gold-plated fountain pen, a gift Grandma had given him for his graduation, and test the ink on a scratch pad. The scratch, scratch, scratch of the nib sounded like a death rattle in the quiet room. "It's just a formality, darling." My mother's voice drifted toward Grandma, light and airy, as if she were discussing the weather. They were so sure of their victory. They had already contacted the contractors. They had already scoped out the luxury assisted living facility 3 towns over, a place of beige walls and scheduled loneliness. They laughed in the privacy of their bedroom about how easy it was, how Grandma's softness was finally paying dividends for them. To them, she was a relic to be archived, a problem to be solved with a signature. As my father moved the papers closer to her, positioning the pen in her trembling hand, the atmosphere shifted. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, stretching across the floor like grasping fingers. The porcelain promises they had spent weeks firing in the kiln of their ambition were about to be tested. I looked at Grandma. Her face remained a mask of placid, fading gentleness. She looked at the line where her signature was required, a line that represented the end of her life as a queen in her own castle. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. I expected her to cry. I expected her to protest, to beg for another year, another month, another day in the only home she had ever known. Instead, she simply looked up at my parents. Her smile was small, faint, and utterly unreadable. It was the smile of someone who had seen empires rise and fall, who knew that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a loud enemy, but a silent one. "If you truly think this is best," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. My parents beamed, their faces lighting up with a predatory triumph that they didn't even bother to hide anymore. They thought they were the architects of this grand design. They thought they were the ones holding the pen, the ones writing the future. They had no idea that Grandma had been the one who built the maze they were currently walking through. They saw only the porcelain surface, fragile, white, and easily broken. They failed to realize that beneath that delicate exterior was a core of tempered steel, and that the house of porcelain promises they were so eager to claim was built on a foundation they didn't even begin to understand. I watched as her hand touched the paper. The ink bled into the fibers, a dark stain marking the official beginning of the end. My parents' laughter, though currently contained within their eyes, was already echoing in the future, a cruel, mocking sound that would soon turn to ash in their mouths. But for now, in the golden light of the drawing room, the betrayal was complete. The sanctuary was sold, the memories were mortgaged, and the silent architect of their downfall sat quietly in her chair, waiting for the clock to strike the hour of their reckoning. The morning sun was a radiant liar. It spilled across the Persian rug in a waterfall of deceptive gold, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the stagnant air of the study, a room that had once been a treasury of wisdom but was now being repurposed as a slaughterhouse for a legacy. I stood in the farthest corner, my back pressed against the cold, unyielding mahogany of the bookshelves, feeling like a vestigial limb of a family that was rotting from the inside out. I was a gargoyle carved from cowardice, my feet rooted in the floorboards as if they had grown vines of lead, keeping me anchored in the shadow, while the light played upon a crime that required no masks, only a pen and a well-rehearsed lie. In the center of the room, the air felt thin, stripped of oxygen by the sheer density of my parents' ambition. They moved with a predatory grace, a synchronized dance of feigned empathy that made my skin prickle with 1,000 icy needles. My mother leaned over Grandma's shoulder, her breath smelling of expensive peppermint and deceit. She adjusted the lamp, not to help Grandma see, but to cast a blinding glare onto the white expanse of the legal documents, further obscuring the treacherous fine print from eyes that were already clouded by the milky veil of macular degeneration. "Just here, Mother." My father's voice was a low, soothing hum, the sound of a cello played by a man who intended to break every string. He pointed a steady finger at the bottom of the parchment. "This is the supplemental insurance we discussed. With your vision, with the way things are going, we need to ensure you have the highest tier of care. This signature simply authorizes us to handle the premiums. It's a safety net, a way to keep you safe in this big, old house." The word insurance hung in the air like a poison mist. It was a masterpiece of linguistic cruelty. They were indeed insuring something. Their own inheritance, their own ascent, their own liberation from the burden of an aging matriarch. To Grandma, the word meant protection. To them, it was the key to the lock they were about to turn. I watched her squint, her head tilting at an agonizing angle as she tried to make sense of the blurred, undulating lines of text. To her, the paper was a gray sea. To my parents, it was a map to a kingdom they had already conquered in their minds. I saw the tremor in her hand as she reached for the fountain pen. It was the same pen she had used to write me birthday cards, the same pen that had signed checks for my tuition, and the same pen that had once chronicled the growth of our family in the margins of a Bible. Now it was a dagger, and my father was guiding her grip toward her own heart. My throat was a desert, my vocal cords paralyzed by a terrifying realization. If I spoke, the illusion would shatter, and I would be forced to choose between the woman who raised my soul and the parents who provided for my body. I chose the silence. I chose the comfort of my own shadow. I watched her finger trace the line, a blind woman walking toward a cliff, while her guides whispered that they were leading her to a garden. "It seems so long," Grandma whispered, her voice a fragile thread that threatened to snap under the weight of the silence. "Are you sure? Are you sure this is just for the medical bills?" My mother's hand landed on Grandma's shoulder, a gesture that looked like a caress, but felt like a restraint. "Would we ever lie to you, Mama? We just want you to be able to stay here without worrying about the costs. We're taking the burden, so you can keep the peace." The irony was a physical ache in my chest. They were stealing the very peace they promised. They were stripping the deed from her hands under the guise of saving her from a phantom debt. I watched as Grandma's eyes searched the room, perhaps looking for me, perhaps looking for a sign of the truth in the architecture she had loved for 50 years. But I was a ghost in the corner, a silent accomplice whose pulse was a rhythmic confession of guilt. Then came the moment of the strike. The nib of the pen touched the paper. I heard the sharp, microscopic scritch of metal on fiber, a sound that, to me, roared like a thunderclap. The ink bled into the page, an obsidian stain that began to form the elegant, shaky script of her name. Ylisabeth. Each letter was a brick removed from the foundation of the house. With the E, she surrendered the rose gardens. With the L, she gave away the library where I had learned to read. By the time she reached the final H, she was a guest in her own life, a tenant in her own memories, a woman who had just signed a warrant for her own exile. My father's face didn't change, but his eyes flared with a sudden, dark electricity. He snatched the paper away the moment the ink was dry, his movements quick and sharp, like a hawk claiming a kill. He didn't wait for the ink to set. He blew on it with an air of clinical finality and tucked it into his leather briefcase, snapping the gold buckles shut with a sound that felt like a gavel hitting a block.
Done.
The tension in the room didn't dissipate. It transformed. It shifted from the breathless anticipation of a hunter to the cold, dismissive aura of a victor who no longer needs to pretend. My mother stood up, smoothing her skirt, her face resetting into a mask of polite boredom. The medical insurance charade was over. The heist was successful. "I think you should rest now, Mother," my father said, already checking his watch, his mind clearly onto the next phase. The movers, the real estate agents, the liquidation of the assets that occupied the rooms upstairs. "The excitement of the paperwork has clearly tired you out." Grandma sat still, her hand still hovering in the air where the pen had been, as if she were waiting for the phantom of her signature to return to her. She looked smaller than she had 10 minutes ago, more translucent, as if the loss of the house had physically diminished her volume in the world. She didn't look tired. She looked hollowed out, a vessel whose contents had been siphoned off while she was looking the other way. I finally moved, my legs trembling as I stepped out of the shadows. I wanted to go to her, to kneel at her feet and scream the truth until the walls bled. I wanted to tell her that the paper wasn't about her health, but about their greed. But as my mother passed me, she gave my arm a sharp, warning squeeze, a silent command to maintain the lie, a reminder of the loyalty I owed to the nuclear family over the ancestral one. I looked at Grandma one last time before fleeing the room. She was staring at the table, her blind gaze fixed on the spot where the document had lain. For a split second, the confusion on her face seemed to flicker, replaced by a shadow of something else, something sharper, older, and infinitely more calculated. It was a look I would remember months later, but in that moment of cowardice, I dismissed it as a trick of the light. I walked out of the study, leaving her alone in the cathedral of her memories, now owned by the very people who intended to demolish them. The ink of betrayal was dry, and as I heard my parents' muffled, jubilant whispers from the kitchen, I realized that the house wasn't the only thing that had been stolen that morning. They had stolen her dignity, and I had handed them the pen. The weight of my own silence felt like a shroud. As I climbed the stairs, each step felt heavier than the last, a journey into a future where we were all haunted, my parents by their greed, me by my paralysis, and Grandma by the house that was no longer a home, but a trap whose jaws were slowly, inevitably closing. The day of the eviction did not arrive with the roar of a storm or the dramatic crash of thunder. It arrived with a chilling, sterile silence that felt far more violent. It was a morning draped in a pale, anemic fog that clung to the skeletal branches of the oaks outside, blurring the world into a smudge of charcoal and ash. Inside the house, the air had turned brittle. The warmth that had defined these halls for decades, the scent of baking bread, the hum of the wireless, the vibrant energy of a life fully lived, had been vacuumed out, replaced by the hollow, echoing stillness of a mausoleum. I watched from the landing of the grand staircase, my hand gripping the banister so tightly the wood grain seemed to imprint itself into my palm. Below, in the foyer, the final act of a Shakespearean tragedy was being staged with clinical efficiency. My parents had discarded their masks of concern in the privacy of the upstairs halls, but here, in the light of the entryway, they maintained a grotesque level of decorum. My father stood by the heavy oak door, his coat buttoned to the chin, looking every bit the successful executive managing a difficult divestment. In his hand, he held a single, battered leather suitcase. It was a small thing, insultingly small. It was a container that dared to suggest 80 years of existence, 50 years of marriage, and a lifetime of motherhood could be condensed into a few changes of clothes and a handful of photographs. He held it not with the reverence of a son, but with the impatient grip of a man handing over a bag of refuse to a collector. "The taxi is idling, mother," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection. It was a statement of logistical fact, as cold and unyielding as the marble floor beneath his feet. Grandma stood before him, wrapped in her old wool coat, the one with the frayed silk lining that she refused to replace because it had been a gift from Grandpa. She looked impossibly fragile, a slip of parchment caught in a draft. She didn't look at the suitcase. She looked past him, her eyes tracing the archways, the crown molding, and the portraits on the wall, as if she were memorizing the topography of a country she was being exiled from forever. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. There was a terrifying, quiet dignity in her posture that made my parents' triumph look small and pathetic, though they were too blinded by greed to see it. Then came my mother's contribution to the theater. She stepped forward, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief, a prop she had likely selected for its aesthetic value. She let out a soft, shuddering sob, a sound so perfectly pitched for a funeral that it felt like an insult to the living. "It breaks our hearts to see you go, Mama," she whimpered, the lace fluttering like a white moth against her cheek. "But the stairs, the maintenance, we just couldn't live with ourselves if something happened to you here. This is for your own safety. You'll see. You'll be so much more comfortable in the new place." It was a performance of breathtaking hypocrisy. I knew, because I had heard them laughing the night before, that the new place was a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that smelled of damp concrete and neglect. My mother's tears were crocodile gems, shining with the reflected light of the commission she expected to make from the house's eventual reimagining. Grandma didn't respond to the sob. She didn't offer the comfort my mother was performatively seeking. Instead, she reached out and touched the doorframe one last time. Her fingers lingered on a small notch in the wood, a mark made years ago to measure my height when I was a child. It was a silent goodbye to a ghost. Then, with a slow, measured grace, she turned and walked toward the idling car. My father followed her, tossing the suitcase into the trunk with a careless thud that echoed through the quiet street. I watched through the sidelight of the door as Grandma settled into the back seat of the taxi. The glass was tinted, but I could see the silhouette of her head, straight, unbowed, staring forward. As the car pulled away, disappearing into the gray throat of the fog, the silence of the house changed. It was no longer the silence of waiting, it was the silence of a vacuum. The moment the taxi's taillights vanished, the atmosphere shattered. The transformation was instantaneous and sickening. My mother dropped the handkerchief as if it were a piece of used tissue, her face clearing of all sorrow with the terrifying speed of a professional actress. My father turned back toward the house, his shoulders dropping their rigid mourner's stance, replaced by a swagger of absolute ownership. He didn't walk back into the foyer, he marched. He looked around the space that was now legally his, bought with a lie and a stolen signature, and a wide, jagged grin split his face. "God, the air is already better in here," he breathed, his voice rich with a dark, celebratory energy. My mother let out a sharp, melodic peal of laughter, a sound that sliced through the lingering stillness like a serrated blade. "The smell of mothballs and old age is finally gone. Do you realize what this means? We can start the renovations by Monday. I've already spoken to the designer about the open-concept kitchen." I stood on the stairs, invisible and horrified, as my father grabbed my mother by the waist. Right there, in the center of the foyer where Grandma had stood trembling only moments before, they began to waltz. It wasn't a dance of grace, it was a dance of desecration. They spun in circles, their shoes clicking sharply against the floorboards Grandma had polished until her joints ached. Their laughter rose in a cacophony of triumph, echoing up the staircase and into the empty rooms. It was a jagged, ugly sound, the sound of predators who had successfully cleared the territory of its previous inhabitant. They twirled past the mahogany clock that Grandpa had wound every Sunday, past the umbrella stand, past the very history of our bloodline, treating the house like a trophy won in a game of wits. To the future, my father shouted, spinning my mother toward the drawing room. To the new era, she shrieked back, her laughter escalating into a feverish, hysterical pitch. I watched them, and for the first time, I felt the cold not as an external force, but as an internal realization. They weren't just celebrating a move, they were celebrating a conquest. To them, Grandma wasn't a mother or a grandmother. She was an obstacle that had been efficiently removed. The waltz was a victory lap over a fresh grave. The winter of the heart had settled over our family. As I retreated back into the shadows of the upper hallway, leaving them to their macabre celebration, I realized that the house didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a crime scene. And as my parents' laughter continued to echo, sharp, cold, and utterly devoid of mercy, I wondered if they realized that a house built on such a foundation could never truly be a home. They thought they had won. They thought the silence of the woman they had evicted was the silence of the defeated. But as I thought back to the way Grandma had looked at the notch in the doorframe, I felt a flicker of something other than grief. It was a memory of that sharp, crystalline focus I had seen in her eyes in the study. The waltz continued below, but the music felt hollow. The real owner of the building had left, taking the soul of the house with her, but she had left behind a cold, creeping dread that even my parents' jubilant laughter couldn't quite drown out. The winter had only just begun. The renovation began not with a sense of renewal, but with the violent, rhythmic thud of a sledgehammer against lath and plaster. It was a surgical strike against memory. My parents had wasted no time. The dust of Grandma's departure had barely settled on the floorboards before the design consultants arrived with their swatches of minimalist gray and their blueprints for a sterile future. They spoke of maximizing flow and purging stagnant energy, terms that served as polite euphemisms for the systematic erasure of a woman who had occupied those rooms for half a century. I watched from the doorway of the master suite as the contractors gutted Grandma's bedroom. It was a room that had once breathed with the scent of lavender and old books, a room where the sunlight seemed to linger longer than anywhere else in the house. Now it was a hollowed-out shell, a cavern of exposed wiring and raw timber. The wallpaper, a delicate floral pattern of climbing tea roses that Grandpa had chosen for her, was being stripped away in jagged, ugly ribbons, falling to the floor like the molted skin of a dying creature. My mother stood in the center of the wreckage, her eyes bright with a feverish, acquisitive light. She was gesturing toward the space where the antique armoire had stood, the one that held Grandma's lace shawls and the letters from the war. "The walk-in closet will extend to here," she proclaimed, her voice rising above the rasp of the pry bars. Floor-to-ceiling mirrors, soft-closed drawers in white oak, and a dedicated island for the jewelry. "It needs to feel like a boutique, not a museum." A boutique. She wanted to transform a sanctuary of soul into a warehouse for her vanity. I looked at the debris piled in the center of the room. A broken leg from a vanity table, a handful of dried rose petals from a forgotten jar, a stray button from a cardigan. These were the discarded fragments of a life, treated with the same reverence as construction waste. My father was equally possessed, pacing the hallways with a tape measure, already calculating the cost of replacing the outdated mahogany banisters with glass and steel. He wanted transparency, yet he lived behind a wall of lies. However, beneath the veneer of this newfound luxury, I began to notice the cracks. It started with the silence. In the past, the silence of the house had been a warm, comforting quilt. Now, it was a cold, pressurized vacuum that seemed to hum with an unsettling frequency. My parents, despite their jubilant waltzing, were growing increasingly brittle. They snapped at the servants, they bickered over the placement of recessed lighting, and they jumped at every unexpected creak of the settling floors. There was a frantic quality to their consumption, as if they were trying to fill a spiritual void with an endless parade of high-end finishes. They had the house, they had the deed, and they had the victory, but they seemed to be looking over their shoulders, as if expecting the very walls to demand payment for the blood they had spilled to claim them. Driven by a guilt that had begun to fester like an open wound, I finally sought out the address my father had scrawled on a scrap of paper, the assisted living that turned out to be nothing more than a cramped, rent-controlled apartment on the fraying edges of the city. The building was a dismal, brutalist slab of concrete, weeping rust stains beneath its windows. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and industrial disinfectant, a sensory assault that made my eyes water. I walked toward Unit 4B, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I expected to find a woman shattered by the betrayal, perhaps huddled in a chair with a blanket over her knees, staring blankly at a television she couldn't see. I expected this stench of defeat. I expected to have to offer a hollow apology to a broken husk. When I knocked, the door was opened not by Grandma, but by a man I didn't recognize, a man in a sharp, non-denominational suit with eyes that missed nothing. He stepped aside without a word, gesturing me into the small living area. The apartment was indeed cramped. The kitchen was a mere kitchenette, the ceiling was low, and the view was of a brick wall across a narrow alley. But as I stepped inside, the atmosphere changed instantly. The chaos and the decay of the hallway fell away, replaced by an aura of startling, monastic precision. Grandma was sitting at a small, circular table near the window. She wasn't huddled. She was poised. She wore a silk blouse I had never seen before, a deep, regal navy, and her silver hair was pinned back with a precision that bordered on the military. In front of her sat a porcelain tea set, the only thing she had managed to save from the house, or so I had thought. But as I looked closer, I realized this wasn't the old set. It was something far more exquisite, something that whispered of hidden wealth and quiet power. She was sipping her tea, her gaze fixed on the brick wall outside, as if she were reading a complex manuscript written in the masonry. She didn't look up when I entered. She didn't look broken. She looked like a general in a command tent, surveying a battlefield that was miles away, but perfectly mapped in her mind.
"Sit down, Marina," she said.
Her voice wasn't the frail rustle of dry leaves I had heard on the day of the eviction. It was a rich, melodic contralto, steady and grounded. The Earl Grey is still hot. I sat, my hands trembling as I reached for a cup. Grandma? I came to see if you were okay. The house, they're gutting it. They're building a closet in your room. I expected a flinch, a tear, perhaps a bitter remark about the cruelty of her children. Instead, Grandma let out a soft, humming sound, not of grief, but of amusement. She finally turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes, which had been so clouded and uncertain in the drawing room of the ancestral home, were now terrifyingly clear. The milky veil was gone, replaced by a sharp, crystalline focus that seemed to pierce right through the facade of my concern. A walk-in closet, she mused, a small, enigmatic smile playing on her lips. How very appropriate. Your mother always did value the exterior over the foundation. She is building a cage for her clothes, while she is already trapped in a cage of her own making. The composure was what terrified me the most. There was no resentment in her tone, only a detached, intellectual curiosity. She looked around the small apartment, not with the eyes of a victim, but with the eyes of a tenant who knows their stay is temporary and their true estate is vast beyond comprehension. The man in the suit stood in the corner, silent and vigilant. He wasn't a caregiver. I realized then, with a jolt of adrenaline, that he was the handyman I had glimpsed during the gala. He wasn't there to fix the plumbing. He was there to fix the future. You don't seem sad, I whispered, the words feeling small in the presence of her immense stillness. Sadness is a luxury for those who have no plan, Marina, Grandma replied, setting her cup down with a delicate, final clink. Your parents believe they have stolen a house. They are mistaken. One does not steal from someone who has already accounted for the theft in their ledger. They have merely accepted a gift they cannot afford to keep. She reached across the table and patted my hand. Her touch was cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. In that moment, the opulence of the house, the luxury of the renovations, and the triumph of my parents felt like a fever dream, a flimsy stage play that was about to be interrupted by the real owner of the theater. The echoes in the opulence back home were the sounds of a crumbling empire. Here, in this cramped, gray room, was the silent architect of its fall. As I looked into Grandma's unwavering eyes, I realized that my parents hadn't kicked her out. She had allowed herself to be moved, positioning herself exactly where she needed to be to watch the walls she had loved so dearly become the walls that would eventually entomb her betrayers. The tea was bitter, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of something other than cowardice. I felt the beginning of a cold, inevitable justice. "Marina," Grandma said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. "Do you know what happens to a house when the soul is removed? It becomes a carcass. And a carcass always attracts the scavengers. Tell me, has the phone started ringing yet?" I shook my head, unable to find my voice. "It will," she said, turning her gaze back to the brick wall. "It will." The visits to the apartment became a ritual of deepening unease and creeping fascination. Each time I slipped away from the ancestral home, which was now echoing with the discordant sounds of power drills and my mother's shrill directives, I felt as if I were crossing a border between two different dimensions. At home, there was the noisy, frantic construction of a lie. Here, in the cramped confines of Unit 4B, there was the silent, meticulous orchestration of a truth. I began to notice the patterns in the peripheral shadows. It started with the delivery man. He was a man of indeterminate age, with the kind of face that one forgets the moment he turns away, yet he possessed a physical presence that was impossible to ignore once you truly looked. He arrived every Tuesday and Thursday, precisely at 2 p.m., carrying boxes that bore the logos of mundane grocery services or office supply companies. But he never used the service elevator, and he never stayed for just a moment. He would enter with the boxes, and when he left 20 minutes later, his gait was lighter, his eyes scanning the hallway with the predatory alertness of a sentinel. Then there was the handyman I had seen during my first visit. He was often there, tucked into the small kitchenette with a tablet or a sleek, high-end laptop that looked wildly out of place against the Formica countertops. He didn't fix the leaky faucet or the flickering overhead light. In fact, the apartment remained purposefully dim, a choice that seemed designed to facilitate the glowing screens he monitored with obsessive focus. He spoke in low, clipped tones into a Bluetooth earpiece, his language a jargon of timestamps, angles, and packet data. I was not a fool, though my parents had raised me to be a decorative one. I began to realize that Grandma's exile was not a retreat. It was a deployment. This cramped apartment was not a dwelling. It was a command center. The most jarring transformation, however, was within Grandma herself. The woman who had fumbled with her pen in the study, whose eyes had seemed perpetually lost in a milky fog of age, was gone. In her place sat a woman of terrifying, crystalline clarity. As the days passed, the physical tremors that had so conveniently proven her frailty vanished. She moved with a sudden economy of motion that suggested a predator who had spent years learning how to remain invisible until the moment of the strike. I watched her one afternoon as she sat by the window. The delivery man had just left, leaving behind a small, obsidian-colored external hard drive on the tea table. Grandma didn't reach for it with the hesitant fingers of an octogenarian. She picked it up with the practiced ease of a technician. She looked at the device not with confusion, but with a grim, satisfied recognition. The light from the window caught her eyes, and for a moment, I had to catch my breath. The cloudiness, the very evidence my parents had used to justify their protection, was entirely absent. Her irises were the color of flint, sharp and sparking with an intellectual fire that made my own mind feel sluggish and dull. She wasn't losing her sight. She had simply been looking at things my parents were too arrogant to see. The silence in the room was thick, laden with the weight of things unsaid. The handyman in the corner adjusted a slider on his screen, and for a brief second, I caught a glimpse of a familiar sight, the grand foyer of our ancestral home, rendered in the high-definition grain of a surveillance feed. I saw my father pacing the marble, a glass of scotch in his hand, looking like a king who didn't realize his throne was rigged with explosives. I saw my mother critiquing a swatch of fabric against the mahogany walls, her mouth moving in a silent, vain soliloquy. They were being watched. Every celebratory waltz, every whispered plot, every moment of their greedy triumph was being recorded, time-stamped, and filed away into the digital ledger of Grandma's vengeance. I felt a cold sweat break across my brow. My parents were living in a glass house, and Grandma held the hammer. The real owner they were so desperate to identify wasn't just a legal entity, she was the ghost haunting their dinner parties, the shadow in the corner of their brand-new walk-in closet. Grandma finally turned her head toward me. The transition from her intense focus on the drive to her grandmother persona was seamless, yet the mask no longer fit quite right. The edges of her steel-trap mind were showing through the porcelain. She didn't offer a cookie or ask about my day. She simply stared at me, her gaze heavy with a wisdom that felt like a burden. "You look troubled, Marina," she said. Her voice was no longer a rustle, it was a resonance, a deep-seated authority that demanded attention. "You look like someone who is beginning to realize that the world is much larger than the rooms your parents have stolen." I swallowed hard, my voice caught in the dry thicket of my throat. "I saw the screen, Grandma. I saw the house."
Why?
"Why are you doing this? You could have just fought them in court. You didn't have to let them throw you out." She leaned back in her chair, the light reflecting off her glasses in a way that hid her eyes, making her look like a blind justice statue brought to life. In court, they would have argued my mind was failing. They would have used their love for me as a shield for their larceny. "No, Marina. To defeat people like your mother and father, one must allow them to feel entirely safe. Only when a thief believes no one is watching will they show you exactly where they have hidden the loot." She reached out and took my hand. Her skin was cool, but her grip was like a vice, unyielding and certain. She leaned in closer, until the scent of cedarwood and old paper enveloped me. The apartment seemed to shrink, the walls closing in until there was only her and the terrifying truth of her intellect. "Marina," she whispered, her voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to my bones. "You have lived in that house your entire life. You have walked those halls, slept in those rooms, and listened to the secrets whispered behind closed doors. You think of it as a place of wood and stone." She paused, her eyes locking onto mine with a sharp, crystalline focus that made it impossible to look away. The shadow in the corner seemed to grow, filling the room with the weight of 50 years of observation. "Tell me," she asked, her voice dropping to a haunting, melodic hush. "Do you believe walls can remember? Do you believe that a house can witness a crime and hold its breath until the moment of the reckoning?" The question wasn't a philosophical one. It was a statement of fact. She wasn't talking about ghosts. She was talking about the hardware. She was talking about the microphones hidden in the crown molding, the cameras nestled in the eyes of the family portraits, and the digital memory that was currently capturing every moment of my parents' hubris. I looked at her, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid for her. I was afraid of her. And even more than that, I was afraid for my parents. They thought they had evicted a helpless old woman. They had no idea they had actually just cleared the way for a masterclass in destruction. I realized then that the real owner wasn't just coming for the building. She was coming for their souls. And as I sat there, the silent accomplice once again, I knew that the walls were not just remembering, they were preparing to testify. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was electric. Grandma went back to her tea, her posture reverting to that of a frail woman looking at a brick wall, but the illusion was shattered. The shadow in the corner had moved, and the countdown to the midnight phone call had officially begun. The ancestral home had been draped in a shroud of meretricious splendor, a gold-leafed mask applied to a face that was already beginning to rot. My parents called it a housewarming gala, a title that dripped with a staggering level of effrontery, considering the warming was being fueled by the systematic incineration of Grandma's legacy. The scent of cedar and old paper had been violently evicted, replaced by the suffocating, artificial perfume of 5,000 white lilies, flowers of morning used, with a chilling lack of irony, to celebrate a new beginning. I moved through the crowd like a specter at a feast of shadows. The house was unrecognizable. The warm, amber glow of the old library had been replaced by clinical, recessed LED lighting that turned every face into a pale, hollowed-out caricature of itself. The guests were a collection of the city's high-altitude socialites, men in suits that cost more than Grandma's yearly pension, and women draped in diamonds that sparkled with a hard, cold indifference. They were the fools of the title, invited to witness a conquest they mistook for a triumph of taste. My parents were at the epicenter of the madness, radiating an energy that was both magnetic and repulsive. My mother was a vision in blood-red silk, her neck adorned with a sapphire necklace that had once been Grandma's most guarded treasure, a piece meant for a wedding day, now worn as a trophy of war. She held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, her laughter ringing out like the sharp, rhythmic clinking of coins. My father stood beside her, his chest puffed with the unearned pride of a conqueror, his hand resting possessively on a marble fireplace mantel that had been installed only 48 hours prior. "To the new era," my father announced, his voice booming over the soft, curated jazz that piped through hidden speakers. He raised his glass, and the crowd followed suit, a forest of crystal stems rising in the air. "To a home that finally reflects its inhabitants. No more dusty corners, no more lingering shadows of the past." A ripple of polite, sycophantic laughter moved through the room. My mother leaned in, her voice pitched just high enough to be caught by the circles nearest to her, carrying that lethal, honeyed tone I had come to loathe. "You wouldn't believe the state we found it in," she whispered, though the whisper was a theatrical projection. Poor Mama. She had turned this place into a reliquary for things that should have been discarded decades ago. It was a mercy, really. She's so much happier now, in a place where she doesn't have to worry about reality. The mercy she spoke of felt like a physical blow to my stomach. I stood near a pillar, my fingers digging into the cold stone, a sickening tide of guilt rising in my throat. I saw the faces of our guests, people who had known Grandma for years, nodding in feigned sympathy, sipping the champagne bought with the money stolen from her very pockets. They were drinking her blood and calling it a vintage. The mockery was a jagged blade, and every time they joked about her fading mind or her charming senility, the blade twisted deeper into my conscience. But then, as I scanned the room, looking for an escape from the suffocating air of the drawing room, I saw him. Near the buffet table, moving with the silent, unobtrusive grace of a shadow, was a waiter. At first glance, he was perfectly unremarkable, tuxedo crisp, hair slicked back, a silver tray held with professional stability. But as he turned to offer a canopy to a laughing socialite, our eyes met for a fleeting, terrifying second. It was the handyman from Unit 4B. My heart skipped a beat, then began a frantic, staccato rhythm against my ribs. He didn't acknowledge me. He didn't even blink. He moved through the crowd with a predator's focus, his presence a dark thread woven into the bright tapestry of the party. He wasn't there to serve drinks. He was there to harvest data. I watched him as he leaned in to refill my father's glass. As he bent forward, the light from the new, ostentatious chandelier caught a small, circular object pinned to his lapel. It was shaped like a decorative button, a tiny black onyx, but it didn't reflect the light like a stone. It absorbed it. It was a lens, a high-definition, wide-angle eye that was currently capturing my father's drunken boast, my mother's cruel mimicry, and the sheer, unadulterated greed that saturated the room. The realization hit me with the force of an icy wave. The Feast of Fools was being recorded for a very specific audience of one. I began to see them everywhere. The staff was a phalanx of Grandma's ghosts. A woman in a maid's uniform, adjusting the drapes with a focus that was entirely too technical. A security guard at the door who didn't look at invitations, but at the faces of the guests, his hand hovering near a concealed radio. They were moving through the crowd like spirits, unseen and unnoticed by the revelers who were too intoxicated by their own status to realize they were being catalogued. The house, for all its new marble and glass, felt like a cage. My parents thought they had transformed the ancestral home into a monument to their success, but Grandma had transformed it into a studio. The very walls they had stripped and repainted were now embedded with the instruments of their undoing. Every confession of their cleverness, every laugh at Grandma's expense, was a nail being driven into the coffin of their reputation. I saw my father pull a group of business associates into the corner, the very corner where Grandma's wingback chair used to sit. He leaned in, his face flushed with wine, and began to detail exactly how they had managed the transition of the deed. He spoke of the forged insurance documents with a smirk, calling it a necessary tactical maneuver to protect the family assets from a declining mind. He was testifying against himself, his words being piped directly into the hard drives in Unit 4B, and he was doing it with a smile on his face. I felt a sudden, desperate urge to scream, to warn them that the floor was not solid, that the air was not empty. But then I remembered Grandma's eyes, the crystalline focus, the terrifying calm. I remembered her question. Do you believe walls can remember? She wasn't just remembering, she was broadcasting. As the night wore on, the gala reached a fever pitch of decadence. The music grew louder, the laughter more shrill, and the atmosphere more frantic. My parents were at the height of their hubris, believing they had finally ascended to the peak of the mountain. They didn't realize they were standing on a precipice, and the real owner was simply waiting for the wind to change. The waiter, the handyman, passed me one last time before the end of the evening. He didn't look at me, but as he moved by, he adjusted his lapel pin with a deliberate, slow movement. The lens caught the light again, a tiny, unblinking eye watching the destruction of a family. I realized then that this wasn't a party. It was an inquest. The guests were the witnesses, the house was the evidence, and my parents were the defendants, blissfully unaware that they had already been found guilty. The Feast of Fools was almost over, and the bill was about to be presented. When the last guest finally stumbled out into the cold morning air, and my parents collapsed onto their new, velvet sofa, laughing about the spectacular success of the night, I stood in the dark hallway and listened to the silence. It was no longer a vacuum. It was a countdown. The walls had seen it all. The cameras had recorded it all. And in a cramped apartment across town, a frail woman with a genius mind was likely rewinding the footage, her tea long since gone cold, as she prepared the final stroke of justice. The laughter of my parents echoed through the halls one last time, sounding less like a celebration and more like a jagged, final gasp. The gala was over. The reckoning was coming. The transition from the ancestral home to Unit 4B was becoming a journey from a gilded hallucination to a brutal, unblinking reality. While my parents spent their mornings arguing over the exact shade of ethereal white for the foyer, I spent mine navigating the gray, industrial corridors of Grandma's exile. The air in the house was thick with the dust of demolition and the stench of my parents' escalating arrogance. The air in the apartment was thin, sharp, and carried the faint, metallic scent of ozone and cooling electronics. It was the smell of a machine waiting to be triggered. I arrived on a Tuesday, the day the delivery man usually made his rounds. But the hallway was empty, and when I let myself in with the spare key Grandma had pointedly left for me, the main room was silent. The handyman was nowhere to be seen. The screens that usually flickered with the grainy, voyeuristic life of my parents' stolen house were dark, their black glass surfaces reflecting my own pale, haunted face. Grandma was not in her usual chair by the window. The apartment felt strangely hollow, as if the intellect that powered it had momentarily stepped behind a curtain. It was then that I saw it. Tucked beneath a stack of innocuous-looking crossword puzzle books on the small dining table was an obsidian-colored accordion folder. It was thick, bulging with the weight of paper that didn't belong in a rent-controlled retirement flat. Curiosity, fueled by a month of suppressed terror and burgeoning suspicion, overcame my sense of propriety. My hands, still trembling from the residual echoes of my parents' morning shouting match over a misplaced credit card, reached for the latch. The click of the folder opening sounded like a bone snapping in the silence. I didn't find medical records. I didn't find brochures for assisted living or faded recipes. What spilled out across the Formica tabletop was a stratigraphic record of my parents' depravity. It was the unseen ledger, a meticulous, chronological dossier that turned the last 10 years of our family history into a crime scene. The first tab was labeled Financial Liabilities. Inside were photocopies of bank statements I had never seen, detailing a spiraling descent into high-interest debt. I saw my father's signature on loans from private lenders that smelled of desperation and predatory interest. There were records of failed offshore investments, surefire, ventures that had evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a trail of margin calls and frantic liquidations. My parents weren't just greedy. They were drowning. The house wasn't a luxury to them. It was a life raft they were willing to kill for. The second tab was even more chilling, the forgery trail. Here, Grandma had collected evidence of their practice runs. There were discarded drafts of her signature, found in the trash months before the eviction, where my mother had clearly been trying to master the specific, shaky loop of Grandma's E. There were transcripts of phone calls, recorded long before she was kicked out, where my father spoke to real estate developers about clearing the title, while Grandma was supposedly asleep in the next room. But it was the final section that shattered my remaining illusions. It was labeled The Invitation. It contained a series of internal memos from a shell company called Ethelgard Holdings. My breath hitched as I read the dates. The company had begun purchasing the underlying land debt and the various liens my father had secretly placed against the property 2 years ago. And the primary shareholder of Ethelgard Holdings was not a faceless corporation or a foreign investor. The signature at the bottom of the articles of incorporation was firm, elegant, and unmistakably Grandma's. The realization hit me with the force of a physical collapse. I sank into the hard plastic chair, the papers fluttering from my nerveless fingers. Grandma hadn't been blindsided. She hadn't been a victim of their clever ruse. She had seen the betrayal coming from miles away, watching it develop like a slow-moving storm on a radar. She had watched them practice her signature. She had listened to them plot her demise. She had monitored their financial ruin with the detached interest of a scientist observing a virus. She hadn't lost the house. She had lured them into it. She had intentionally played the role of the fading matriarch, leaning into their stereotypes of age and frailty to encourage their hubris. She had allowed them to steal the deed because she knew the deed was already a hollow shell. By letting them take the building, she had effectively trapped them inside a monumental liability. They were currently spending their last remaining liquid assets and several more loans they couldn't afford to renovate a structure that she already owned through a different door. The house was not her sanctuary anymore. It was a Trojan horse, and my parents had spent the last month enthusiastically decorating the interior of their own prison. You were always a quick study, Marina. I jumped, the papers sliding across the table as Grandma stepped out from the small kitchenette. She was holding a fresh pot of tea, the steam rising in a gentle, mocking plume. She looked entirely different today. Gone was the wool cardigan and the performative squint. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, and her eyes were as sharp as diamond-tipped drills. Grandma, I wheezed, gesturing vaguely at the mountain of evidence. You knew. You knew everything. The insurance papers, the eviction, you let them do it. She set the teapot down with a clinical, decisive thud. She didn't look remorseful. She looked satisfied. A person who steals a loaf of bread because they are hungry is a tragedy, she said, her voice cool and resonant. But a person who steals their mother's heart because they are greedy is a predator. And one does not negotiate with predators, Marina. One provides them with enough rope to ensure they cannot escape the knot. She walked to the table and began tidying the papers I had scattered, her movements precise and devoid of any elder care fragility. They thought they were being Machiavellian. They thought they were the masters of the long game. But they forgot who taught them how to play. They saw a woman who was old, and they assumed that meant empty. They wanted the house so badly they didn't stop to ask why I made it so easy for them to take. I looked at the dossier on my father's gambling debts. Why let it go this far? Why the apartment? Why the humiliation? Grandma leaned over the table, her shadow falling long and dark across the records of my parents' sins. Because justice is not about prevention, Marina. It is about revelation. If I had stopped them at the first forged signature, they would have played the victims. They would have blamed stress or a misunderstanding. But by letting them win, I have allowed them to document their own malice. Every dollar they spend on that walk-in closet is another piece of evidence of their intent to defraud. Every laugh they shared at that gala is a testimony to their lack of remorse. She looked out the window toward the skyline, where the silhouette of our ancestral home was hidden behind the city's concrete teeth. They are currently sitting in a house they don't own, spending money they don't have, celebrating a crime that has been recorded from 4 different angles, she whispered, a thin, cold smile touching her lips. I didn't lose my home, Marina. I simply moved my seat to get a better view of the fireworks. I felt a sickening mixture of awe and horror. My parents were monsters, yes, but Grandma was something else entirely. She was a grandmaster playing a game against opponents who didn't even realize they were on the board. The unseen ledger wasn't just a record, it was a death warrant. As I looked at her, I realized that the real owner of the building wasn't just a legal title. It was a statement of absolute, crushing power. My parents had kicked her out of her home, but she had evicted them from her heart long ago. Now, she was just waiting for the ink on the final chapter to dry. Go home, Marina, Grandma said, her voice softening just enough to be terrifying. Watch them. Enjoy their luxury while it lasts. The phone call is coming soon, and I want you to be there to see the look on your father's face when he realizes that the walls he thought he bought are actually the bars of his cage. I left the apartment in a daze, the weight of the unseen ledger imprinted on my mind. As I walked back to the house of porcelain promises, I didn't see a home anymore. I saw a trap. And as I heard my mother's distant, shrill laughter through the open windows of the foyer, I realized that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a wolf. It's the shepherd who decides to stop protecting the sheep. Returning to Unit 4B felt less like a visit to a relative and more like a descent into a subterranean vault where the gold of truth was being minted from the dross of my parents' lies. The air inside the apartment had grown even colder, stripped of any lingering domesticity. The tea was no longer the centerpiece. It had been moved to a side table to make room for a bank of monitors that flickered with the ghostly, monochrome life of the ancestral home. The handyman, who I now understood to be the architect of this digital panopticon, sat amidst a tangle of wires, his fingers dancing across a keyboard with a rhythmic, percussive speed that sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock. Grandma beckoned me into the small, dimly lit bedroom, a space that had been converted into a viewing gallery for a tragedy. She didn't sit on the bed. She stood by a tall, industrial-grade server rack that hummed with a low, predatory vibration. The transformation I had seen in her previously was now complete. She had shed every vestige of the grandmotherly persona, the soft sweaters, the hesitant steps, the cloudy gaze. She was draped in a tailored black silk robe that made her silver hair look like a crown of cold lightning. Sit, Marina, she commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an invitation to witness the anatomy of a slaughter. You have seen the ledger. You have seen the paper trail. But paper is a silent witness. It can be burned. It can be shredded. It can be denied. To truly dismantle a soul as corrupt as your father's, one needs a more immersive form of testimony. She tapped a key on a remote, and the wall-mounted screen flared to life. What followed was a serpentine revelation of my parents' true nature, a curated symphony of surveillance that made my blood turn to ice. It began with the audio, crisp, high-fidelity recordings of conversations held in the privacy of their bedroom months before the eviction. I heard my mother's voice, stripped of its socialite sweetness, sounding like a dry rasp as she discussed the optics of Grandma's accidental decline. We need to ensure the doctor sees the confusion, she whispered in the recording, her voice echoing through the small apartment like a ghost's confession. A little extra of the sedative in her evening tea, just enough to make her wander, just enough to make her look unmoored. I felt a violent jolt of nausea. They hadn't just waited for her to age. They had actively tried to poison her mind to accelerate the appearance of her unfitness. My father's response was a low, appreciative chuckle, a sound so devoid of humanity it felt like a serrated edge against my skin. Then came the visual evidence. The screen cut to a wide-angle shot of the library. I saw my father, hunched over the mahogany desk at 3 a.m., illuminated only by the cold glow of a desk lamp. He wasn't reading. He was hunched over a lightbox, painstakingly tracing Grandma's signature onto the medical insurance documents I had seen signed in Chapter 2. I watched him practice the loop of the E over and over, his face twisted in a mask of intense, criminal concentration. It was a cold, clinical heist performed in the dead of night, recorded by a camera hidden in the eyes of the very portrait of Grandpa he had so casually ignored. The private investigator I hired, Arthur, is not merely a man who follows people, Grandma said, her voice a low, melodic vibration in the dark. He is a specialist in digital forensics and covert environmental monitoring. He has spent the last 18 months turning your home into a recording studio for their hubris. Every whispered plan of malice, every forged stroke of the pen, every moment of their cruelty has been catalogued, time-stamped, and backed up to 3 separate cloud servers. She turned to another screen, showing a grid of video feeds. I saw my mother in the newly built walk-in closet, laughing as she tossed Grandma's old jewelry into a discard pile. I saw my father meeting with a shady developer in the garden, discussing the demolition of the carriage house. They were moving through their lives with the absolute confidence of predators who believed they had cleared the woods of all competition. Why? I whispered, my voice trembling. Why did you let them get away with the tea? Why let them poison you, even a little? Grandma leaned toward me, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in her eyes, making them look like twin Arctic stars. Because, Marina, a crime without a victim is a misdemeanor. A crime with a victim who allows herself to be wounded, just enough to document the intent, is a death sentence. I didn't drink the tea, child. I had Arthur swap the canisters months ago. But I played the part. I let them believe their plan was working. I gave them the satisfaction of their cleverness so they would become careless. She paced the small room, her movements fluid and predatory. She looked like a serpent that had spent years coiling itself around its prey, waiting for the exact moment when the breath began to fail. Justice, Marina, is often mistaken for a blunt instrument, a hammer, a sword, a scream, she said, pausing to look at a screen showing my parents clinking glasses over a successful debt restructuring. But true justice, the kind that leaves nothing but ash behind, is a dish best served with mathematical precision. It is an equation where every variable must be accounted for before the final solution is revealed. She pointed to the screens. Variable A, the intent to defraud. Documented. Variable B, the physical forgery of legal instruments. Documented. Variable C, the psychological abuse of a vulnerable elder. Documented. Variable D, the illegal liquidation of assets they do not own. Documented. She turned to me, her face a mask of terrifying, intellectual triumph. Tomorrow, the interest rates on the private loans your father took out will trigger a default. The real owner of the land will emerge from the shadows. And when they turn to the law for protection, they will find that the law has been watching them through my eyes for a very long time. The math of their destruction is already complete, Marina. I am simply waiting for the clock to strike midnight so I can hit enter. I looked at the woman who had raised me, and I realized I didn't know her at all. She wasn't just not weak, she was a force of nature that had been contained within a porcelain shell for decades. My parents hadn't just made a mistake, they had committed a theological error. They had tried to outwit a goddess of the long game. The serpentine revelation was not just about the evidence. It was about the realization that the world I lived in, the world of my parents' power and luxury, was a flimsy cardboard set that Grandma was about to kick over. The PI in the other room wasn't a staff member, he was the executioner's assistant. As the recordings continued to play, a loop of my parents' mocking laughter and their secret, greedy whispers, I felt the last remnants of my loyalty to them evaporate like mist in a furnace. They weren't my family. They were the variables in an equation of ruin. Grandma reached out and touched my cheek. Her hand was warm now, as if the cold calculus of her revenge had finally sparked a heat within her. "Don't look so frightened, Marina," she whispered. "The math only punishes those who cannot balance the ledger. You are the only part of their legacy that isn't a debt. You are the only thing in that house that I intend to save." She turned back to the monitors, her profile sharp and unyielding against the glow. The serpentine plan was in its final coils. The precision was absolute. And as I heard my father's recorded voice laughing about how easy it was to break an old woman's heart, I realized that the silence that was coming for them would be the loudest thing they had ever heard. The revelation was over. The trap was set. The mathematical certainty of their downfall was no longer a theory, it was a countdown. And Grandma, the silent architect, was finally ready to sign her own name to the final document. The hour was 11, a time for the settling of accounts and the creeping of shadows. Inside the ancestral home, the atmosphere was one of heavy, sated decadence. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the lingering, floral ghost of the evening's high-priced scotch. My parents were draped across the new, velvet sofas in the drawing room, looking for all the world like deities who had finally claimed their rightful Olympus. The renovations were nearly complete. The house was a gleaming, sterile monument to their successful heist, a shell of marble and glass that felt as cold as the hearts of its new masters. I sat in the dim light of the library, the door slightly ajar, watching them through the sliver of space. My father was scrolling through his tablet, a predatory smirk playing on his lips as he reviewed the projected valuation of the restored estate. My mother was admiring her reflection in a new, gilded mirror, tracing the line of her sapphire necklace, the one that had once belonged to Grandma, with a finger that was as sharp as a talon. They were convinced of their invulnerability. They were certain that the world had finally aligned itself with their greed. Then, the silence was eviscerated by the sound of the telephone. It wasn't the chirping of a smartphone or the polite hum of a modern device. It was the old landline, the heavy, brass-bottomed relic that remained on the mahogany side table, a piece of the past that my father had kept only for its vintage aesthetic. Its ring was a sharp, percussive intrusion, a mechanical scream that seemed to resonate through the very floorboards Grandma had polished until her hands bled. My father frowned, his gaze shifting from his tablet to the vibrating handset. "Who on earth is calling at this hour?" he muttered, his voice thick with the entitlement of a man who believed his time was too precious to be interrupted. He reached out, his hand steady and arrogant, and lifted the receiver. "Yes." I held my breath, the silence in the library becoming a vacuum. I could hear the faint, distorted crackle of a voice on the other end, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "This is Elias Thorne," my father said, his tone shifting into the patronizing, authoritative rumble he used with subordinates. He clearly expected a business associate, perhaps a contractor seeking a late-night approval or a lackey confirming a transaction. "I assume this is urgent, considering the hour." But as the voice on the other end continued, the arrogance began to drain from my father's face. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, tectonic shift. His brow furrowed, his grip on the receiver tightened until his knuckles turned a ghostly, bloodless white, and the smirk that had defined his face for weeks vanished, replaced by a look of profound, squinting confusion. "I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice losing its resonance. "Who did you say you were representing? Ethelgard Holdings? I'm not familiar with the name. We have no business with such an entity." He listened again. The room seemed to grow colder, the light from the chandeliers suddenly feeling brittle and artificial. My mother had stopped admiring herself. She stood frozen, the sapphire necklace clutched in her hand like a rosary of blue ice, her eyes fixed on my father's crumbling expression. "What do you mean, the land?" my father asked. The word land came out as a strangled gasp. "This house has been in my family for 3 generations. The deed is in my name. I have the papers right here in the—" He was cut off. The voice on the other end, the legal representative of Ethelgard Holdings, was evidently not interested in his papers. I could almost feel the coldness of that voice through the air, a monotone delivery as relentless as a heartbeat monitor. It was the sound of an immutable fact being delivered to a man who had lived his life on a foundation of fiction. A ground lease? My father's voice cracked. He stood up, his legs looking suddenly frail beneath his silk robe. There is no ground lease. The property and the structure are. He stopped again. His eyes began to dart around the room, frantic and wild, as if the very walls were starting to close in. 50 years? Expired. When? Last month. The revelation was a physical blow. I knew what he was hearing because I had seen the unseen ledger in Unit 4B. Grandma had not merely watched them, she had maneuvered them into a legal labyrinth. Decades ago, during a period of financial restructuring that my grandfather had managed with quiet brilliance, the ownership of the land and the ownership of the house had been severed. It was a technicality, a dormant legal structure that had remained hidden beneath layers of family trust. My father, in his rush to steal the deed to the building, had never bothered to look at the soil beneath it. He had assumed that because he held the keys to the door, he held the rights to the earth. "You can't do this," my father hissed. Though the hiss lacked the venom of a predator, it was the sound of a cornered animal. "We have spent hundreds of thousands on renovations. We have a legal claim to." The voice spoke again, short and final. I heard the word eviction. Not the quiet, respectful departure they had forced upon Grandma, but the violent, legal extraction of a trespasser. Ethelgard Holdings wasn't just claiming the land. They were informing him that the real owner had declined to renew the lease. The house, the marble, the glass, the walk-in closet, the very air they were breathing, was now a tenant on a property that had just been repossessed. The deed my father had forged and fought for was a worthless piece of parchment, a title to a structure that had no legal right to stand upon the ground it occupied. "The owner," my father whispered, his voice a hollow echo of its former self. "I want to speak to the principal of Ethelgard. I don't deal with intermediaries. Give me a name." There was a long pause. I could hear the mechanical click of the line being transferred, or perhaps just the silence of a trap finally snapping shut. My father's face was a mask of gray ash. He looked at my mother, who was now trembling so violently the sapphire necklace fell from her hand, hitting the marble floor with a sharp, discordant clink. Then, a new voice came through the receiver. It wasn't the lawyer. It wasn't a representative. It was Grandma. I couldn't hear her words, but I saw the effect they had on my father.
He didn't speak.
He didn't argue. He simply stood there, the receiver pressed to his ear, as his entire world was eviscerated by a few softly spoken sentences. His knees finally gave way, and he slumped back onto the velvet sofa. The sofa he had bought with stolen money, in a house he didn't own, on land that had just been reclaimed by the woman he had kicked out into the winter. The call ended with a soft, final click. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It was the silence of a vacuum, of a life being stripped of its oxygen. My parents sat in the center of their opulence, looking like two children playing dress-up in a ruin. The house of porcelain promises had finally shattered, and the shards were everywhere. "She owns the dirt," my father whispered, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. "Marina, she doesn't just own the house. She owns the dirt. We're squatters." My mother let out a low, keening wail, a sound of pure, narcissistic grief. But I didn't feel pity. I felt a surge of cold, exhilarating justice. The first domino had fallen, and as I looked at the dark windows of the drawing room, I realized that the real owner was no longer in exile. She was everywhere. The midnight phone call was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The walls were remembering, the land was testifying, and my parents were finally realizing that you can never truly own something that you stole from the soul of another. The silence that followed the midnight phone call was not a void. It was a physical weight, a pressurized atmosphere that seemed to squeeze the very breath from the room. My parents sat amidst the wreckage of their own ambition, their silhouettes cast long and jagged against the newly plastered walls. The house, which only hours ago had felt like a fortress of their own making, had transformed into a cage of glass and debt. The mask of the successful scion and the elegant matriarch didn't just slip, it disintegrated, leaving behind the raw, trembling visages of two thieves who had realized the gold they stole was actually painted lead. Panic, when it arrived, was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing dissolution. I watched from the threshold of the drawing room as my father's composure evaporated. He began to pace, his movements frantic and erratic, like a trapped animal measuring the dimensions of its cell. His silk robe, once a symbol of his leisure, now looked like a shroud. He went to the mahogany desk, the scene of his many forgeries, and began to tear through the drawers, flinging papers into the air like white, wounded birds. "There has to be a mistake," he hissed, his voice a jagged rasp that scratched against the silence. "A ground lease? A 50-year severance? It's a legal impossibility. Thorn land is thorn land. I checked the titles. I checked the deeds." But he hadn't checked the soil. He had been so obsessed with the structure, the visible, ostentatious proof of his power, that he had neglected the foundation. My mother was even worse. She was huddled on the velvet sofa, her hands clutching her head as if to keep her very reality from spilling out. Her makeup, so carefully applied for the gala, had begun to smear, dark tracks of mascara running down her cheeks like soot. The sapphire necklace lay on the floor near her feet, a discarded blue eye watching her unravel. "The renovations, Elias," she whispered, her voice climbing into a thin, hysterical pitch. "The marble from Carrara. The custom cabinetry. The plumbing we replaced in the entire West Wing.
We used the bridge loans.
We used the remainder of the inheritance. We've spent nearly $2 million on this house in the last 6 weeks." The realization hit them like a tectonic shift. They had poured every cent of their stolen capital and their borrowed credit into a building that sat on land they did not own. In their haste to modernize and purge Grandma's influence, they had effectively gifted a multi-million-dollar renovation to the very entity that was now evicting them. They were the most expensive decorative contractors in the city, and they had just finished working for their worst enemy for free. By 2 a.m., the house had become a war room of desperation. My father had called 3 different lawyers, his voice alternating between bullying threats and pathetic pleas. Each call ended the same way, with a heavy, final silence. The ground lease was ironclad. Ethelgard Holdings had acquired the debt and the underlying land rights with surgical precision. There was no loophole. There was no family exception. "Who are they?" my mother demanded, her voice shaking as she stood over my father, who was now hunched over a laptop, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. "Who is Ethelgard? It sounds like an old name. A European firm? Some vulture fund, looking to flip the neighborhood? We can negotiate. We can offer them a percentage of the sale. Everyone has a price, Elias. Everyone wants a profit." I watched my father's fingers fly across the keyboard, his face illuminated by the cold, blue light of the screen. He was digging, burrowing into the digital layers of shell companies and offshore trusts that Grandma and her private investigator had woven around the truth. He was looking for a person, a man in a suit, a corporate board, a faceless executive, anyone he could bribe, charm, or sue. "It's a blind trust," he muttered, his voice hollow. "Registered in the Caymans, but managed through a local firm. Ethelgard, it means noble protector. Pure pretension." He clicked through another layer of filing. I saw the cursor hover over a PDF of the Articles of Incorporation. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I knew what was on that page. I had seen the elegant, firm signature in Unit 4B. "Wait," he whispered. "The primary beneficiary, the sole shareholder." He froze. The silence in the room became absolute. Even the house seemed to stop its creaking. I moved closer, my shadow falling over the desk. My father's eyes were wide, fixed on the name at the bottom of the screen. It wasn't a corporate entity. It wasn't a bank. It was a name he had spent the last month mocking. A name he had tried to erase with the stroke of a forged pen. Elizabeth. He breathed. The name sounded like a confession. Elizabeth and Thorn. My mother let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob.
"No."
"That's impossible." Mama doesn't know how to open a bank account without help. She can't see the buttons on a phone. She's in a one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the slums. We put her there. She owns it, my father said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, flat monotone. He turned the laptop toward my mother, the screen reflecting in her panicked eyes. She didn't just own the land. She is Ethelgard. She's been buying back the liens for years. While I was taking out loans to cover my losses, she was buying the debt. She let us take the house, Clara. She let us forge the papers. She let us spend every dime we had on these renovations because she knew that the moment we finished, the lease would expire. The mask had not just collapsed. It had been crushed. The frail woman they had discarded like a piece of broken furniture was revealed to be the master of their destiny. They hadn't kicked her out of her home. They had been granted a temporary stay in her trap. My mother began to pull at her hair, a truly primal gesture of ruin. She watched us. She watched us do it. At the gala, the waiters, the staff. The walls, I said, my voice finally breaking the silence of the room. They both turned to look at me, their faces twisted in a mixture of shock and dawning horror. They had forgotten I was there, the silent observer. The daughter they had assumed was too weak or too complicit to matter. She asked me once if I believed walls could remember. I said, stepping into the light. She wasn't being poetic. She has everything. The forged signatures, the recordings of you planning the medical decline, the footage of the gala. She didn't lose anything. She just moved to a better vantage point to watch you destroy yourselves. My father looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the man he used to be, or perhaps just the man he wanted me to believe he was. But the look was quickly replaced by a cold, dying embers of rage. You knew? You've been seeing her? You helped her do this to your own parents. I didn't help her, I said, and the truth felt like a cold, cleansing rain. I just didn't stop her. Just like you didn't stop when you saw her hand trembling as she signed your lies. I learned my silence from you, Father. The room descended into chaos. My mother began to scream, a high, wordless sound of pure ego death. She began to claw at the ethereal white wallpaper as if she could peel back the reality and find her old life underneath. My father simply sat there, staring at the name Elizabeth on the screen, his mind finally grasping the mathematical precision of his own undoing. They had spent their savings, their reputation, and their souls on a building that was now a monument to their failure. They were squatters in a palace they had built for the woman they hated most. The luxury they had flaunted was merely the decor for their own eviction. The sun began to rise, a pale, sickly gray light filtering through the expensive new drapes. It didn't bring warmth. It only illuminated the dust of their collapsed lives. The phone rang again, but this time, my father didn't answer. He didn't have to. The real owner was no longer calling. She was already at the gates. As I walked out of the room, leaving them to their ruin, I realized that the house didn't feel heavy anymore. The secrets were out. The walls were done remembering. And as I looked up at the portrait of Grandpa in the foyer, I could have sworn that the shadow of a smile had finally returned to his eyes. The mask was gone. The truth was all that remained. And the truth was that Grandma was coming home. The morning air was a sharp, clinical blue, smelling of frost and the impending finality of a gavel strike. At precisely 9 o'clock, the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath heavy tires announced the arrival of the end. I stood on the portico of the ancestral home, watching as a fleet of black vehicles pulled into the circular driveway with the synchronized grace of a funeral procession. The house, gleaming in its stolen splendor of new marble and polished glass, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the authority now descending upon it. My parents stood behind me in the foyer, two hollowed-out shells of the predators they had been. My father hadn't slept. His eyes were mapped with red veins, his shirt rumpled, his hands twitching with the phantom sensation of a pen he no longer held. My mother was draped in a silk wrap, her face a pale, frozen mask of disbelief. They were waiting for a miracle, for a lawyer's call, for a loophole in the physics of their own destruction. But miracles do not grow in soil sown with betrayal. The car doors opened. First came the men in uniform, officers of the court, their presence a cold, bureaucratic promise of order. Then came Arthur, the private investigator, no longer disguised as a waiter or a handyman, but dressed in a sharp, slate-gray suit, carrying a ruggedized laptop like a weapon of war. Finally, the rear door of the lead vehicle opened, and the real owner stepped out. It was not the woman who had left in a taxi 6 weeks ago. Grandma did not emerge with a trembling hand or a bowed head. She stepped onto the gravel with the poised, lethal elegance of a monarch reclaiming a stolen throne. She wore a coat of deep emerald wool, her silver hair styled in a severe, timeless chignon. She held a cane, not for support, but as a scepter of office. Behind her followed a legal team that moved with the quiet confidence of people who had already won the war. As she ascended the steps, the very air seemed to vibrate with the frequency of her arrival. My father moved forward, his mouth opening to speak, to perhaps offer one last, desperate lie, but the words died in his throat as the lead officer stepped into the foyer, a set of legal documents in his gloved hand. Elias and Clara Thorne. The officer's voice was a flat, amplified resonance. By order of the High Court and on behalf of Ethelgard Holdings, you are hereby notified of an immediate eviction from these premises. The ground lease has expired, the title to the structure has been vacated due to proven fraud, and you are ordered to vacate the property immediately. The word fraud hung in the air, like a guillotine. Arthur stepped forward, flipping open his laptop. With a few keystrokes, the high-definition monitors my parents had installed in the drawing room flared to life, but they didn't show the art they had curated. They showed the recordings, the midnight forgeries, the whispered plans to medicate Grandma into senility, the laughter at the gala. The house itself began to testify, its digital nerves broadcasting my parents' sins in a loop of unblinking clarity. The reality of their total exposure finally broke them. The vanity, the greed, the arrogance, it all dissolved into a pathetic, visceral desperation. My father was the first to fall. He collapsed to his knees on the marble floor he had stolen, his hands reaching out to clutch at the hem of Grandma's emerald coat. "Mama, please," he sobbed, the sound a wet, ragged rasp of a man who had run out of ground. "We were desperate. The debts. We did it for the family. We did it to keep the legacy alive. Have mercy. You can't turn your own son onto the street." My mother sank down beside him, her performative grace replaced by a frantic, clawing need. She reached for Grandma's hand, her voice a shrill, keening whine. "Think of the optics, Mama. Think of Marina. We'll do anything. We'll pay it back. We'll stay in the guest house. Please, just don't do this to us in front of the neighbors." They were a tableau of moral bankruptcy, begging for family mercy from the very person they had treated as a disposable asset. They spoke of the family as if it were a shield, forgetting they had already used it as a sharpening stone for their knives. Grandma stood perfectly still. She didn't flinch as they touched her. She didn't look down with the tearful eyes of a wounded mother. She looked at them with a terrifying, crystalline focus, the gaze of a judge who had finished reviewing the evidence and found no mitigating circumstances. She let the silence stretch until the only sound in the foyer was my mother's frantic breathing and the rhythmic hum of the servers recording their final humiliation. Then, she slowly withdrew her hand from my mother's grasp, her movements deliberate and devoid of heat. "Family mercy?" Grandma's voice was a low, melodic vibration, yet it carried the weight of a mountain. It wasn't the voice of a victim. It was the voice of the architect. "You speak of the family as if it is a debt I owe you, rather than a sanctuary you desecrated. You sat in this very room and toasted to my fading mind, while you drank wine bought with my blood." She stepped back, creating a cold, impenetrable distance between herself and the two people who had tried to bury her alive. She looked around the foyer, at the new walls, the sterile lighting, the modernization that had cost them their souls. "You thought you were so clever," she continued, her eyes flickering with a sharp, intellectual fire. "You saw my age, and you saw an opportunity. You saw my quietness, and you saw an invitation to steal. You believed that because I chose to be kind, I had forgotten how to be strong." She leaned in slightly, her shadow falling over them like a shroud. The officer stood back, the private investigator remained silent, and even I felt the gravity of her presence, pulling the light from the room. You mistook my kindness for fragility, Elias. You mistook my silence for absence, she whispered, her words cutting through their pleas like a diamond through glass. That was your final mistake.
I didn't lose this house to you.
I let you hold it for a moment, so I could see exactly what you would do with the power you thought you had stolen. She turned to the lead officer and gave a single, imperceptible nod. Remove them, she commanded. They have 10 minutes to take what they brought with them. Everything else, every piece of marble, every custom cabinet, every renovation, is now the property of Ethelgard Holdings. A late payment fee for the years of deceit. The reckoning at the threshold was absolute. As the officers moved forward to haul my parents to their feet, I saw the look on Grandma's face. It wasn't one of joy or even of anger. It was the look of a woman who had finally balanced an impossible ledger. My parents were led toward the door, their voices rising in one last, futile crescendo of blame, accusing each other, accusing the world, accusing the very air for not supporting their lies. As they passed the threshold, Grandma didn't look back. She walked toward the center of the foyer, her cane clicking rhythmically on the marble, and looked up at the grand staircase. The real owner had returned. The thieves were in the garden, and the queen was back in her counting house. Marina, she said, not turning around, her voice steady and warm for the first time. Go and pack your things from your old room. We're moving your furniture back into the library suite. This house is finally clean. The door closed behind my parents with a heavy, final thud, and for the first time in years, the ancestral home felt like it could finally breathe. The walls had finished remembering. Now, they were ready to start a new story. The aftermath of the reckoning was not a storm, but a long, slow cooling, the kind that follows a forest fire, where the air is thick with the scent of carbon and the ground is covered in a fine, silver dust. My parents did not go quietly into the night. They went loudly into the public record. The news of the Thorne scandal rippled through the city's social circles like a stone dropped into a stagnant pond. The housewarming gala was recast in the press as the vulture's last supper. Stripped of the house, the land, and the investments they had funneled into a property they didn't own, my parents' financial house of cards collapsed with terrifying speed. The bridge loans were called in. The fraud charges, bolstered by Arthur's digital treasury of recordings, moved through the prosecutor's office with the weight of an avalanche. They moved from a mansion of marble to a world of legal aid and depositions, their faces appearing on the evening news not as icons of success, but as warnings of the cost of hubris. They were bankrupt in every sense of the word, fiscally, socially, and spiritually. But inside the ancestral home, the air was different. The renovations remained, a permanent scar of their greed, but Grandma had begun the slow process of reclaiming the soul of the space. The clinical LED lights were replaced by the warm, amber glow of filament bulbs. The sterile, ethereal white walls were being covered again by the heavy velvet drapes and the bookshelves that had been held in climate-controlled storage, another detail I hadn't realized Grandma had managed from her cramped apartment. I found Grandma in the mahogany library late one Tuesday afternoon. The room smelled of old paper and beeswax, the scent of my childhood returning like a long-lost friend. She was sitting in her original wingback chair, the one with the worn leather and the history of 1,000 stories embedded in its seams. She wasn't looking at a monitor or a dossier. She was looking at the fire crackling in the hearth, her hands resting peacefully in her lap. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. I felt like a trespasser in my own home, a ghost of the girl who had stood silently in the corner while the ink of betrayal dried. The guilt I had carried, the weight of my own cowardice, felt like a leaden shroud that I didn't know how to shed. You've been standing there for 3 minutes, Marina, she said, her voice a soft, resonant hum that didn't need to rise above the crackle of the logs. The floorboards in this wing have always been talkative. Come, sit. I approached her, sinking into the ottoman at her feet. The opulence of the house still felt sharp around the edges, a reminder of the parents who were now facing a cold, gray future in a courtroom. "They're calling it the crime of the decade in the papers," I whispered, staring into the flames. "Everything they built, it's all ash." "It was ash the moment they conceived it," Grandma replied, her gaze remaining fixed on the fire. "They tried to build a legacy on the foundation of a lie. You cannot expect a house to stand when you have poisoned the earth it rests upon." She turned her head to look at me, and for the first time, the genius architect was gone, replaced by the woman who used to tuck me in when I was 6. Her eyes were no longer flinty or sharp. They were deep, weary, and infinitely kind. "I learned something from you, Grandma," I said, my voice trembling. "I saw how you did it. The precision.
The PI.
The way you waited. I didn't realize how much power you had." Grandma reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Power, Marina, is like the tide. The waves that crash and scream against the rocks are the ones that break. The power that moves the world is the deep water, the part that is silent, that observes, that simply is." Your parents screamed their success from the rooftops, but they never bothered to look at what was happening in the shadows. True power doesn't need to shout to be heard. It only needs to be patient. The silence of a library was a healing balm, but it also made the words I needed to say feel gargantuan. I looked down at my hands, the tears finally blurring my vision. "I'm sorry." I choked out, the words finally breaking through the dam of my fear.
"I'm so sorry, Grandma."
I stood in that corner. I watched them trick you. I watched you sign those papers, and I didn't say a word. I was a coward. I let them take you away. I expected a lecture. I expected her to remind me of my complicity. Instead, she gently lifted my chin until I was forced to meet her gaze. "Marina," she said softly, "why do you think I let you see the PI? Why do you think I left the folder for you to find? Why did I leave you the key?" I blinked, confused. "I didn't need your help to defeat them," she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "I needed you to see the difference between being a victim and being an observer. I didn't want you to save me. I wanted you to save yourself. You weren't a coward, child. You were a witness in training. You had to see the full cycle of their rot so that you would never, ever plant those seeds in your own heart." She pulled me into a brief, firm embrace. "The only person you need to forgive is the girl who thought she had no choice. That girl is gone. You are the thorn who remains." As the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and gold across the library floor, we sat together in the quiet. Outside, the world was still moving. The lawyers were still filing motions, the bank was still seizing assets, and my parents were still grappling with the wreckage of their lives. But inside these walls, the debt was paid. The legacy of ash belonged to the thieves. The legacy of grace belonged to us. We watched through the tall windows as the light faded from the gardens Grandma had reclaimed. The house felt solid again, no longer a trap or a crime scene, but a home. A place where the walls didn't just remember the bad things, but were ready to hold the weight of something new. "It's finally ours, isn't it?" I asked, looking at the setting sun. "It was always ours, Marina," she whispered, her voice blending with the approaching night. "They were just the guests who overstayed their welcome." The sun dipped below the horizon, and as the first stars appeared over the mahogany roof, the silence of the house was no longer a vacuum. It was a promise. Justice is a dish best served with the mathematical precision of love and patience. We hope this story offered you a moment of enlightenment amidst the shadows of betrayal. We would love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe, as Grandma did, that walls can remember? If this story resonated with you, we kindly invite you to subscribe and walk with us through more tales of the human spirit. Thank you for lending us your time and your heart.